Greetings. Today we're going to talk a little bit about ecotherapy, its founding, its history, some of its practices, its key ideas. And in order to do that, I want to start by telling you a little anecdote about how I got involved in it, because that will have something to do with how many people can benefit from ecotherapy. So, um, some years ago, I was in training to be a psychotherapist, which I practiced for a while before moving full time into education. And during my training, at one point of it, I started to get depressed. And so I was in therapy at the time per the requirements of the therapy program. And my therapist of the time saw that I was depressed, and she said, "Yeah, I can see it in you. Your energy's low. You're kind of flat. Um, Not so much sad, or depression isn't so much an emotion as just kind of a lack of vitality and feeling flat. Your affect is flat." So she said, "Why don't I send you to a psychiatrist and then you can get on some medication?" And I didn't want to do this at first, but I didn't like feeling flat either, and I didn't like not sleeping well and not having enough energy to both work full time and be a full time student. So I agreed, and I got put on an antidepressant, which I took for several months, and it was actually helpful. Um, so if you thought that where I was headed with this is don't use antidepressant, no, no, it depends on the situation. It depends on the person. In my case, they were helpful, and they brought me up to the point where I actually had emotions, and then I could work with them. Now, toward the end of when I was using antidepressants, I started to spend a lot of time in the garden. And while I was out working, I was with somebody who was teaching me gardening in exchange for me doing some manual labor for her that she was now too old to do. So it was a good trade. I got to learn all kinds of things about gardening I wouldn't have known otherwise. And then I would help her pull weeds and do compost, turn the compost pile and stuff like that. And I really enjoyed working with her. She had this habit in the morning when we went out to the garden of addressing all the plants as though they were people. So she would say, "How is everybody today?" And and she'd look over the garden and try to get the mood, as she put it. What's the mood of the garden today? So at some point she told me, you'll get the full benefit of this if when you're not doing any heavy lifting, of actually putting your hands in the soil and not using gloves. And so I did that. And I noticed that right away my mood started to rapidly improve and my energy level. So eventually I went off the antidepressants, and I haven't been on them since. Now, one of the reasons I'm mentioning this is because I was trained the way most psychotherapists were trained, the way my therapist was trained. And I don't mean this in any way blaming, it's just how we were taught. And the interesting thing about that teaching, that paradigm of psychology, is that my psychotherapist knew all about conflicts that I was having, communications issues, relationship issues. She knew about my childhood. She knew all those things that a therapist should know, but she didn't know anything about my schedule. She never asked me, "How much time do you spend outside every day?" She never asked me, "Do you spend any time with plants and animals? Does your schedule permit you any free time? How much fun are you having? Or are you just working all the time?" Things like that. What's your nutrition like? So, because she didn't ask any of those questions, I took medication instead of gardening. Now, gardening won't work for everybody, I think, but there are some pieces of research that indicate that soil bacteria, particularly Mycobacteria vaccae, has an elevating effect on neurotransmitters in the brain, especially serotonin. And so that could be part of what I was experiencing, and perhaps was just the joy of being outside. But in any case, it's possible that we've got plenty of antidepressant right in the ground. And so an experiment for you to try is sometime when you're feeling kind of flat or down, scoop up a handful of fresh soil and hold it for at least 20 minutes and see if it makes any difference to you. It may not, but you can see for yourself how this might work. So around that time, when I was learning firsthand about the benefits of what we now call ecotherapy, I was contacted by ecopsychologist and ecotherapist Linda Bizzell. And we had heard a bit about each other's work. And she said, you know, it's been a while since that eco psychology anthology came out that Sierra Club Books published. What if we approach them with the idea of a new anthology that's kind of an update to it? But this anthology would focus specifically on ecotherapy as a form of applied eco-psychology. One of the criticisms that the original anthology had received was that it was heavy on ideas, but kind of light on practice. So Linda's idea was that we would go to contact a number of people, many of whom actively practiced ecotherapy in different ways. And so our anthology would be both a collection of new ideas about healing relations with the earth, but it would also be a set of practices that people could actually try out. And so it took us a couple of years and a lot of back and forth with our contributors, but eventually we published Ecotherapy, our anthology, in 2007, I think, 2008, through Sierra Club Books, and they used a cover design that was similar in format to the anthology. And one of the things, to our delight, that happened with that anthology was we were able to get a piece from one of the original eco-psychology spokespeople, which was Ted Rozak. And I called him up one day and I said, do you have anything that you've been working on, or would you just like to contribute something that speaks to the state of eco-psychology and ecotherapy these days? And he said, well, you know, actually I just wrote a piece that's similar to that and I've been wondering where it should go, so maybe it should go into your anthology. And so we published it. I believe it was the last thing he wrote, or one of the last things at any rate. But so what a blessing that was to receive that piece from him. There was a piece that we didn't get that I should mention just because of the funny way it came about. And then let's talk about what ecotherapy is and how it was founded and all that. But at one point I called up Patch Adams, and a lot of people will recognize that name. He's the famous clown doctor, and Robin Williams played him in a film some years ago. And he's the founder of the Gesundheit Institute, where medicine is radically re-envisioned. And so it's a marriage between standard Western medical practices and fun. So a lot of clowning and a lot of informality, and as part of that, a certain amount of ecotherapy, because nature is part of the cure. So we tried to get a piece from him, and he was willing to submit something, but he spends so much time out of the country fundraising that he wasn't able to give us that chapter. But I'm mentioning this in part because at one point when we were on the phone, I said, Dr. Adams, just out of curiosity, I said, this is kind of a sidebar, but what would it be like to have you as a doctor? Like, if you were my doctor, what would that be like? And he said, are you mobile or immobile? And I said, oh, let's say I'm immobile. And he said, okay, that's great. I would come over to your house and we would have a long talk, and then I would get to know you as a person. And while we were talking, I would go through all your stuff, and I would open up your closets and your drawers and your desks, and I'd read in your journal, and I would do everything that I could to find out what you were really like. And then we would come up together with some medical, he didn't use the word intervention, some medical services for you to participate in. And then he said, as part of that, I would wheel you outside if it was a beautiful day, because in many ways, nature is the best doctor. So in ecotherapy, one of our assumptions is that nature can also be the best therapist, the best psychological healer. So this idea is it's kind of like eco-psychology itself. Ted Rozak said that all psychologies were originally eco-psychologies, meaning the people who practiced them, whether that was shamans or medicine people or curanderas or whoever did it, didn't make a firm separation between the natural world and the practice of healing. They were integrated with each other until relatively recently in history. And that's true for ecotherapy too. People have always practiced ecotherapy. It's nothing new. It's just that now we have a new set of concepts for it. We have research to back it up, which I'll be talking about later. And we have a set of ideas and practices that actually fit the Western mindset, the industrial world mindset, in a way that couldn't fit it if it didn't grow up that way. So there's a lot to be gained from all that. And the person who seems to have coined the word ecotherapy was Howard Kleinbell. Now, around the time that there was a lot of eco stuff in the air in the early 90s. So around the time that the first eco-psychology anthology was published in 1995, Howard Kleinbell was doing eco work with his clients, actual hands-on eco work with his clients. And he grew up, I believe, Connecticut, and in any case, he grew up on a farm and learned a lot by interacting with plants and animals and just growing up in that setting and really soaking it up. And then later, he did all kinds of other interesting things. He trained in and became a pastoral counselor. He was in the civil rights movement. He walked with King on at least one occasion. So in him, ecological practice, spirituality, and eco-justice talk to each other. So what gave him the idea for ecotherapy was he was seeing people in his practice the way pastoral counselors do. It's similar to therapists in terms of the format. Come to my office, we'll have a conversation, and then you leave, and then we'll regularly schedule it. So he was doing that, and he kept thinking, how come we're not outside? Why are we in here talking when all these healing forces, powers, landscapes, animals, plants are out there? So he spontaneously began inviting people outside. I don't think he knew this, but there was another psychological practitioner who had the same idea some time ago. His name was Sigmund Freud. He would go on long walks they were called patients at the time, with his patients. And Freud also had a dog present in therapy. So in some ways, Freud was our first animal-assisted therapist. And I'll talk about AAT a little later. So Kleinbell was stepping into a bit of a tradition, but he began talking to people outside, and in conversations like that, the whole world becomes your container. And there's an exercise I recommend, by the way, that takes advantage of this. So we spend so much time indoors that we don't realize that the rooms that we're in compress the intensity of our conversations. You know, the walls are right here, and if it's a small room, it's even more intense, like an office building or a cubicle or whatever. So when you have a difficult conversation with somebody, there's all that compression happening all around you in the environment. So the exercise I invite people to do is this. Sometime when you have to have a tough conversation with somebody, whether it's a coworker or a family member or somebody you're in a relationship with, go outside. Go outside and do it while you're walking or while you're sitting together on a bench or sitting on the seaside or whatever it is, and see if it goes better than it might have otherwise. Another way of kind of pre-testing this would be to do it like this. So I'll walk you through it right now. Close your eyes, and I want you to imagine a tough conversation that you had relatively recently, an argument, or being criticized, or even insulted by somebody. So take a moment and just imagine that. Imagine some relatively recent, difficult conversation that you had. And as you imagine it, as you remember it, remember how it made you feel. Remember what it brought up for you and why it was difficult for you emotionally. And and actually feel it in your body as you remember it. Now, as you're doing all this, if you're able to, I want you to get up and go outside. I'll wait. And if you're not able to because of whatever surroundings you're in, or if you're not able to actually get up and walk out, then keeping your eyes closed, I want you to imagine that you're walking outside or that you're wheeling yourself outside if you're in a wheelchair or being brought outside by somebody. So let's just take a minute and either walk outside or imagine that you're going outside. And pause the recording. Okay, now as we start up again, think about when you did that just now, when you either went outside or imagined that you were outside. Think about the difference in how it made you and your body and your emotions feel. What most people experience is an opening up, an expansiveness, a relaxation, a lessening of intensity, and kind of a feeling, right? So this can be a useful technique for when you have those difficult conversations and you're not sure how they're going to go. So just remember this one as something that you can try out live and see how it actually works for you. We used to, as a species, have all of those conversations outside where we came from. So we wonder sometimes if the intensity of our arguments and the way we combat each other, in part at least, has to do with our urban surroundings. Something to think about. So, going back to Kleinbell, he coined the word ecotherapy, and his definition of it was that ecotherapy is healing and growth nurtured by healthy interaction with the earth. And he said this in his book, which was published the year after the Ecopsychology anthology. And his book was Ecotherapy, Healing Ourselves, Healing the Earth. So first the Ecopsychology anthology, and then Kleinbell's work. And Kleinbell also referred to this as earth-centered therapy. So ecotherapy employs many different methods in disciplined and systematic attempts to reconnect the psyche and the body with the terrestrial sources of all healing. That is a definition that comes from the anthology that Linda Bazell and I put together, Ecotherapy, Healing with Nature and Mind. So as a body of knowledge and practice, ecotherapy, which includes the natural world as a partner in mutual human, non-human healing, has certain goals that I'll get to. There's something I want to mention, however, right up front, which is this. Kleinbell used to talk about what he called the ecological circle. And in this circle, we receive healing from some aspect of the natural world, whether that's scenery or the elements or plants or animals or what have you. But we have to give something back. Because if we don't, it's not ecotherapy, it's exploitation. And then we're just mining nature for its useful effects. So rather than do that and perpetuate what has gotten us into so much trouble with the natural world to begin with, we make sure that ecotherapy is always relational. It's always an exchange of some kind. And that we always show appreciation to the beings, plants, animals, places, whatever it is, that give us so much. And if possible, actually advocate for them. So always important to bear the ecological circle in mind. If there's not an ecological circle, then it's not ecotherapy. That's what makes ecotherapy different from an ordinary nature cure, of which they've been in existence forever. So some key goals of ecotherapy. One of them is to transform our relationship with the natural world. So to move us from being users and spectators into conversation partners, appreciators, co-participants in the dialogue that's always happening between us and the natural world. So that's one goal of ecotherapy. A second goal of ecotherapy is sustainable community building as a result of that transformation. In a way, this leans a little bit on the deep ecology platform, which assumes that if we experience our sense of self as being intimately connected with nature, we will behave differently toward nature. And this can be in quite small ways as well as large ones. It doesn't mean that you have to become a backpacker or that you have to scale mountains. It can mean that you just notice the sound of the rain or you see the beauty of a landscape and you allow that to transform you from the inside out. A third goal of ecotherapy is to outgrow the perceived split, I emphasize perceived, between mind and planet, human and non-human nature. There's a documentary in which the archetypal psychologist James Hillman talks about this split, and he refers to the idea that we stand apart from nature as a thought disorder because we can't stand apart from nature. But it's thinking that we do that causes the dysfunction, the pathology of how we actually relate to the natural world. So at its deepest level, ecotherapy seeks to heal that by reestablishing the relationship. So an analog in the human sphere would be there's somebody very important in your life who you're alienated from, but who really belongs in your life, and you belong in theirs too. So you reach out and make contact, and then you regrow the relationship. And as a result, you're both healed. So I mentioned before that in his book, Voice of the Earth, Ted Rozak said, once upon a time, all psychologies were eco-psychologies. The same with ecotherapies. So some premises of ecotherapeutic healing. One, discerning nature contact is a powerful source of mental and physical healing. And I'm going to give you examples of this as we go. Discerning nature contact. In other words, simply going out and being your normal self might or might not be good for you. In some cases it probably is, in other cases it probably doesn't make any difference one way or the other. But if you can apply your consciousness to it, then you can get the benefit of the healing. Premise number two, the deepest healing is always relational. That's true for psychotherapy too. I remember doing therapy with well-intentioned people who would say, maybe I shouldn't be, they would come in with relationship issues and they would say, maybe I shouldn't be in a relationship for a while so I can get myself together and be healthier. And I would usually tell them some version of, well, in some cases that would be an appropriate thing to do. And, especially if your whole life is falling down, right? Or if you just left a relationship or whatever. But I told them, just keep in mind that there are certain issues that only surface when you're with somebody, and they will be dormant in your psyche. And so you can work on yourself all you want. You can become wiser, you can become more knowledgeable, you can do this, you can do that, learn new things. But when you get into a relationship with somebody and they trigger your wounds, part of you is going to go back to being 3 years old. And that's when you have to deal with it. That's when you got to grow it up. And it won't surface otherwise. So healing is always relational. And it's the same thing with our relationship to the natural world. Third premise of ecotherapy is that self and ecosystem heal together. So this is the same premise that we saw in ecotherapy's parent field, which is eco-psychology. Self and ecosystem heal together. So what do ecotherapists actually do? At the time that I'm recording this, ecotherapy actually is a job category listed in, I forget what it's called, but it's the United States federal list of occupations. So it's in there. But there's not all that many people doing ecotherapy, calling it ecotherapy. There's a lot of people doing ecotherapeutic practices. So for instance, there's a lot of people doing horticultural therapy, gardening therapy, and they may never have even heard the word ecotherapy because they've never came across Kleinbell or anthology or any of the research that's been done. The same with animal-assisted therapy, but those are forms of ecotherapy because ecotherapy as a term is an umbrella term meaning many different kinds of nature, earth engaging healing. But there are people, an increasing number of people, who do practice as ecotherapists. Some of them have psychotherapy training like Linda Bizzell. Some of them don't. And there was a certificate that I designed and launched some years ago at John F. Kennedy University, and it was a certificate in ecotherapy, and we graduated a number of people through that certificate. And then eventually that went away, and I went on to work at other schools. And then I believe Linda launched an ecotherapy certificate at Pacifica Graduate Institute, and that's an on-off certificate. And I should mention too that we have a certificate in ecopsychology available there as well. Linda's doing the ecotherapy part of it. That's through the Pacifica Retreat Center. But there are a small but growing number of people in the States who call themselves ecotherapists who do ecotherapy work. I would say probably at this point at least a dozen and maybe more than that. And what do they do? So they do nature coaching and counseling, including taking people outside where that's appropriate to help them get more of a conscious connection with the natural world. Ecotherapists have private practices, and they do workshops and educational webinars. Ariana Candell is an ecotherapist she interviews other eco people and other practitioners and has a lot of things available on the internet. They work for nonprofits, and they do community level mentoring. Phoenix Smith is involved in that. They're often in gardening and nature programs. They do some healthcare setting advising. So bringing to healthcare, different kinds of healthcare organizations, the benefits of ecotherapy. They work on behalf of educational sustainability resourcing. They do ecotherapy as a supplement to coaching or psychotherapy oftentimes, but not always. And then they do environmental justice advocacy as well. So those are a couple of examples of the things that ecotherapists do occupationally. So at this point, I wanted to mention to you a few ecotherapy techniques, many of which you can simply try out and see how they work for you. So in all of these, we keep the idea that nature is our co-therapist. These are not intrusive, they're not dangerous, they don't require a great deal of time spent outside. They're relatively easy to do, but they're potentially profound in their effects. So one thing that Linda Bizzell likes to do when she works as an ecotherapist is when she starts seeing a client, she gets a sense of what their schedule is, their daily schedule, hour by hour, and even minute by minute sometimes when they have really busy schedules. And she gets a sense of where nature fits or doesn't fit in that schedule. So one thing you can do for yourself is to create your own schedule. And a lot of us think that we know our schedule off the top of our heads, and some of us do. But it's good to actually write it out so that you can see how much time you spend doing different things. And oftentimes, Linda has found that people are quite surprised at where all their time is going. So the goal here is not to have an optimally super busy schedule or to cram more stuff in or anything like that. The goal is actually almost the opposite. It's to challenge yourself to work in more interaction with plants, with animals, with soil, with the elements, with the sky, and actually take that in, actually have an experience with that and a relationship with it. So when I did this with my own schedule some years ago, and I realized I really hate waking up to an alarm clock. It's jarring. I've never liked it. So I don't do it anymore. I noticed too that I didn't feel quite rested sometimes when I went to bed really late and I got up really late. And so I decided to do an experiment and I thought, what happens if I go to bed not all that long after the sun sets and then I get up right before sunrise and start my day that way? How would that feel? So I tried it out just as an experiment and that enabled me to stop using the alarm clock. And I feel really good on that schedule. So I've done that now for a number of years. And there are occasional situations, like if I have to catch a really early plane, that I'll use my alarm clock, but very rarely. And when I spend so much time in the morning getting up and exercising and listening to the world wake up and watching the sun come up, it makes me feel grounded and like I'm a part of things in a way that I didn't ever feel otherwise. So just a simple intervention like that can make a huge difference in how you see yourself and other people, how you go about your daily routine. So the daily schedule, looking that over and finding out what's taking your time and where you can fit in some walks outside, for instance, or swimming or something. So that's one thing to do. And of course, it's even more fun if you do that with other people, family members or a couple. So we've talked a little bit about this, but actually prescribing nature. And this is a cross-cultural practice, forest bathing in Japan, for instance. So actually scheduling this in and saying, I'm going to get some ecotherapy in this week because I've got, let's say you have a stressful week going on, you have a lot piled up. So at the end of the week, I'm going to go to the park, or I'm going to go visit a waterfall, or I'm going to go to the beach, or some piece of nature that's near you, and just be with it. Now, when you first do this, sometimes what this brings up is a bit of restlessness and even anxiety because many of us, especially in the industrialized nations, are so plugged into our distractions that we can't even do without our cell phones anymore. Psychoanalysts sometimes refer to that as the electronic umbilical cord, right? So unplug the cord just for an hour, just that much, and be with not only with yourself, but be with everything else and everybody else that's out in the natural world. The first few times you do this, you might fidget a little bit, but you'll get used to it. Your body will start recognizing that, okay, now I can relax into the natural pace of everything. And you'll have more energy at the end of the week too. So it's just a matter of getting over the hump of the habit of being constantly overstimulated and always like this, and letting yourself relax at least for an hour into something that's bigger than you are. So an actual nature prescription. One thing you can do if you're more analytically inclined is to give yourself a self-rating from 1 to 10 before and after that kind of a nature intervention in terms of your mood. So for instance, let's say in terms of vitality or happiness or just being in a good mood, you're a little bit low. So let's say you're a 3, right? So go and do a nature intervention and then rate your mood after that. And that'll show you in the numbers that there's actually a difference. So that's something to do. And you can keep track of that over time as well and see how much of an effect that actually has on you. The great thing about all this, by the way, a lot of this is that you can do it yourself. You don't need a specialist, you don't need a prescription, you don't need to spend a ton of money on pills or anything like that. You can just go experiment with your own ecotherapeutic regimen and see what works for you and what doesn't. And it's free. So I mentioned the intervention of taking the conversation outside, and so that it's de-intensified, going out someplace safe that you can have a difficult conversation in. And one thing that comes up for some people is intergenerational trauma that has to do with the natural world. So being mindful of that, being mindful of your family's relationship to nature as it goes back through time. And this can bring up some pretty intense feelings for you to deal with, but then you can integrate those feelings into your life, and so they won't be so intense. So for instance, sometimes here in the States, Hispanic kids often will be children of parents who, for instance, there's one, actually not often, but there's one situation I'm thinking about that comes up now and then where a parent said to me, I have mixed feelings about my children playing in gardens and things like that because I was a worker in the fields for so long, and I was out there breaking my back and being mistreated by people and getting sprayed by pesticides. And so if you come from that sort of a group, then nature for you means being exploited and abused. And of course, you wouldn't want your kids to go through that. So part of the task there is learning that the relationship to the natural world can be one of receiving healing and abundance. So it's a pity that so many people are turned against nature by some form of exploitation or colonization. Another example would be African Americans who don't think of the place in the woods as a pretty nice, safe place to have a picnic, but the place where your ancestors got lynched, right? And that kind of pain echoes down the generations. It's not something that happened 100 years ago, or even 50 years ago, or even more recently, and then it's just done. It stays in families. So oftentimes that conditions your response to the natural world. And my colleague Phoenix Smith works with other Black people to have those feelings come up in natural settings, deal with them, heal them, and be able to access the natural world in different ways. By the way, I'll mention her website too if you're interested in that kind of work. It's ecosoul.com. Ecosoul.com, Phoenix Smith. One thing too that I should mention that comes up for a lot of us nowadays is being called eco-anxiety. I get asked about this all the time by students, by reporters, by colleagues. What do you think of eco-anxiety? And what they're referring to is when you listen to a news story or turn on the TV and you see some new aspect of global warming and you start freaking out and panicking. And I've often replied to that question by saying it's not anxiety, it's fear. It's rational fear, right? My colleague, Stephen Harding, who's an ecologist at Schumacher College, likes to say, he has a bit of dry English humor going on, but he's deadly serious too. If you don't have eco-anxiety these days, if you don't have a reaction to what's happening, you need to get into therapy and figure out why you don't. So be that as it may, whether you agree with that or not, a lot of people do have eco-anxiety happening, or eco-fear, as I prefer to call it. What do you do about it? It's important to share it with supportive people who also feel the same way so that you can come up with some kind of a response, whether that's nature advocacy or creative work, or somehow weaving that into your own wisdom inquiry and your wisdom path. But it has to be responded to somehow. And then you can feel like you're part of making a difference in the world, and it helps. So there's an exercise I do in the classroom that you can actually do on your own as well, where although my telling you what the exercise is will probably just spoil it, but that's okay. What I've done sometimes, it works really good on a big whiteboard where you ask people to just call out in 1 or 2 words some current ecological issue that they're anxious about. So someone will say global warming, and somebody will say food, or water, fresh water running out, or whatever. And so I write all of these on the board, and I scatter them around. I don't write them in a list. And I keep going until everybody's done. And then I'll pick 2 at random, and I'll say, okay, colony collapse disorder, how is that related to agricultural practices that are non-sustainable? And then I'll have somebody explain that relationship to me, and when they do, I draw a line from one to the other. And then I'll take another 2. How is this, or I'll take a third one. How is this related to the 2 that we just linked? And so you don't have to do it with every item on the board. That would take a long time. But you do it with enough items that you can then make the case to people. Wouldn't you say that these are all connected? Every one of these is connected to something else, right? And then you draw in some lines. And then for the last part of this exercise, I would make a suggestion on a systemic level. I would say, if these are all connected, then if you pick one of them that most matters to you, and you do your homework on it, and you do your inner homework on it and find out what it brings up for you, and then you fashion a response to it somehow. For some people, that means activism. For other people, it means something more reflective or a creative work or a discussion circle or some other way of dealing with it, right? If you're tackling that one issue, are you not influencing all of them in some way on a systemic level, right? So if everybody who is concerned about this, and not even everybody, if only 10% of us maybe, listen to ourselves for what got into the heart, what really activates you, did your homework on it, got in a little bit of discussion about it with other people, and then decided to do something to raise awareness about it, would that not start really changing the situation collectively? So that's one thing to try out too. That's an ecotherapy exercise that I've taught in class, and I also teach it when I train therapists. And then let me give you another exercise. This one comes from Howard Kleinbell, and this is another one that I've used a lot. I do some teaching of the environmental science graduate students at UCSB, and I always bring this exercise with me, and it's called Earth Stories. And so it's best done outside, but you can do it in the classroom too. I've done it both ways. And this one's better to do with other people, even if it's just one other person who likes this kind of work, you know, who's interested in trying this out. And so an Earth story is not an explanation, it's a storytelling in which you relate an incident in your life that made you very aware of some aspect of nature. It really showed you that there was something really vital and interesting and important about some aspect of the natural world. So for some people, it's something that a pet did, something that an animal did. For some people, it's maybe a peak experience that they had in nature. For some people, it could be a tragedy. There was a group that I was doing this exercise with once, and a woman spoke, and she told a situation. It was so painful for her to have been in this. I mean, painful isn't even a strong enough word. She was at the beach once, and a wave came and swept one of her family members into the ocean, and that person drowned. So she said, "I hate the ocean." And she said, part of the reason I'm in this class is because I want to get over that. I don't want to think of nature like that, you know. So she brought something in that needed healing. And so by the end of the course, she had a many-layered, complex reaction to the natural world rather than just hatred or fear, you know. Other people will say, I was out in a forest and it suddenly occurred to me that the trees that were around me were also talking not only to me but each other, and I could actually in some intuitive way discern that, and it completely changed my relationship to the natural world. Or somebody might mention something that was healing for them in nature. But in any case, telling earth stories, and the beauty of this technique is that it doesn't require a lot of interpretation, and the main thing for the others to do while the telling is going on is to listen empathically and not really interpret, and certainly not make comments like, well, if you had realized this at the time, or anything like that. It's not for giving advice, right? It's just for taking it in, and while the person's telling the story, you're imagining it along with them. So they tell it like a story, not an explanation, not theoretical. And there's some mysterious magic that happens when you hear each other's earth stories. And when you do it in a large enough group, there are common themes that come up in the earth stories that people tell that knit the group together. It's really a beautiful practice. I feel grateful to Kleinbell for coming up with it. So, let's see. Let me talk a little bit about this issue of eco-anxiety once again. One of the things that comes up again and again with ecotherapy is dealing with this tremendous planetary crisis that we're in. And so I wanted to mention a few ways that ecotherapy, a few more ways that ecotherapy deals with that. Now, in our ecotherapy anthology that Linda Bazell and I put together, there's an article by her and Sarah Edwards on the stages of awakening. And so what they found is that when people wake up to the state of environmental crisis that we're in, they often go through certain states of mind in a certain order. And it doesn't always follow exactly like this, but it often does. And so their idea is that if we can accompany people through these stages, or be accompanied if we're going through them ourselves, then we can come to a different place with all of it and get out of denial. So I'll just give you the schema briefly. So this is called Stages of Awakening, and what they find is a lot of us start out in denial. This can't be happening. And then usually there's a kind of following upon or intertwined with denial, there's a kind of semi-consciousness. Things don't feel right, you know, something's up, something's in the air. And then thirdly, there's an awakening of some kind, and usually it's painful. Usually there's a shock, or you read a news item that disturbs you, or you're in conversation with somebody and you go, oh wow, this is really huge, right? Humanity's facing something it hasn't faced before. And so stage 3 is awakening. So denial is stage 1, semi-consciousness is stage 2, and awakening is stage 3. Stage 4 is shock. It's the emotional ugh that follows upon this. Stage 5 is despair, which is often accompanied by guilt or hopelessness or powerlessness. It's sometimes a necessary emotional place to go when you're dealing with all this, but none of these are a good place to stay. So necessary to experience in some cases, but not to stay there, right? So if you allow yourself to be in them, they move of their own accord. That's been my experience as well as Linda's and Sarah's. And then the 6th stage in dealing with eco-anxiety is that you come to a sense of, I think acceptance is the wrong word, but you come to a sense of empowerment and action, and you get to where you're saying, okay, I've been through all these different emotions, now I want to do something productive. And then you enter the creative phase of all this, which we'll talk more about. But that's a way of going through stages of awakening and getting to the place of empowerment, which is a good, necessary place to be these days, given what's going on. So, on the level of something that looks a little bit more like therapy, but isn't psychotherapy per se, ecotherapy assessment is something that's done by ecotherapists when they're working with clients. And it's also something that you can do with yourself. So some questions to ask yourself as you get acquainted with how all this works and with your relationship to the natural world. So one question is, one I asked earlier, how much time do you actually spend outside every day? And the question that goes with it is, how comfortable are you out there? And there's no good or bad around this. It's just something to notice. Some people are more outside directed than other people. Just as there's some people that love cities more than countryside, and the other way around too, vice versa. Everybody's different that way. So there's no optimal, right? Except for you, you know. So this is about discovering where your level is. An assessment question is, how much time do you actually spend every week around plants and animals? What is your normal daily schedule? We talked about that earlier. What time do you get up and go to bed? Do you like your schedule? Or is it burdensome somehow? How do you like your body? Do you actually live in it? Or do you kind of drive it around like a car, you know, which a lot of us do, right? Are you comfortable in it? Are there aspects of it you don't like? Because your body is a little bit of nature. It's kind of your emissary to the natural world. What's the longest you've ever lived anywhere? You know, how frequently do you move around? And do you ever get to know these places? What's the quality of your connection with your local community? Are you active in it? Are you not active in it? What senses do you use the most? Which of your senses, and when do you use them? And one reason these questions are important is that oftentimes we're finding when we do ecotherapy that some forms of discomfort or disturbance or even illness that we take for just ordinarily psychological or personal actually are a direct reflection from one of these questions. They're a direct symptom of something that we're not getting from nature. So because of the civilization we live in, that tends to be invisible. So I'll give you an example. When our anthology came out, I was going on podcasts and participating in interviews to make people aware of the book. And I mentioned the point that I just mentioned to you. And so the host said to me, well, what would be an example of that? What would be something that people tend to pass off as just psychological or just a part of their ordinary life that actually has a connection to how they relate to nature? And I said, well, I don't have good research evidence for this, and we're going to get to research in a moment here. I don't have good research evidence for this, but I've noticed that a lot of people who get involved in this will often tell me that they used to spend most of their evening after work watching TV and falling asleep in front of the TV because they were depressed, mildly or moderately depressed. And when they began to engage with nature more consciously, they spontaneously stopped doing that. So our thought about that is that not in every case, some people just like going to sleep in front of the TV, but in some cases, people are using that as a kind of self-medication of their lack of contact with the natural world. And there was this long pause, and the host said, actually, I do that. And I thought, I just put my foot in it. And I said, oh, sorry, I didn't, And he said, no, now, because now I'm thinking about it. Now you've got me actually wondering about it. So he decided to try it out and see if that was true for him, So that is one of many possible examples. Some of our, what we think of as our anxieties and our depressions and places where life just feels irritable can be symptoms of being too severed from contact with the natural world. So that's something for you to explore yourself and see if there's any truth in it for you. So let's talk a little bit about the research that supports all this. I'm going to mention a number of studies that have been done, and bear in mind that this is a small sample. There has been way more work done, especially in the last couple of years, on how enhancing our connection with nature heals us on multiple psychological, physical, and social levels. So this is a tiny piece of that bulk of research that's been done. The remarkable thing about it, too, is there's almost no disconfirming research. In other words, I haven't seen any research that says that if you spend more time outside, you get worse. You get more depressed or more anxious or whatever. Some people do get a little anxious initially if they're not comfortable being out there much. But aside from that, there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of that kind of research. So here's some examples. So this is University of Cambridge 2017. Exposure to and photographs of natural environments promote a more positive body image in this study. Stanford. Moderate amounts of time outside boost cognition and memory. That's a 2015 study. Again, Stanford 2015. Participants who went on a 90-minute walk through a natural environment showed reduced neural activity in an area of the brain linked to risk for mental illness compared to urban walkers. Outward Bound in University of London 2012, being outside more stimulates creativity. University of Alberta 2013, Even short nature exposure brings stress relief and drops cortisol levels. University of Rochester 2010, time outside heightens feelings of aliveness and well-being. Providence St. Peter Hospital 2006, horse therapy with rape victims lessen depression, anxiety, and other symptoms of PTSD. Um, Animal-assisted therapy with horses is also used for a number of other forms of suffering like post-traumatic stress disorder, especially in combat vets, various forms of anxiety. So Mind Mental Health Charity 2001, 71% of participants showed less depression after walking in a green area. University of Illinois 2001, green activity alleviates symptoms of ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. CNRS and University of Poitiers 2009, stimulating natural environments help treatment of cocaine addiction. New York University 2005, gardening therapy led to lower heart rates and better dispositions in cardiac rehab patients. And then I'll mention one more. This was a meta-analysis done in the United Kingdom in 2010. In just 5 minutes of exercise outside, in a park, in a garden, and so forth, one sees both physical and mental health benefits. Some of the psychological benefits that have come up both in the research and just in the practice of ecotherapy: decreased anxiety, decreased depression, stabilized mood overall, diminished antisocial behavior, increased positive interactions, higher self-esteem, greater control of anger, higher sense of self-efficacy, the sense that you're capable of doing things, joy, contentment, and centering. The physical benefits of ecotherapy include lower blood pressure, steadier heart rate, improved circulation, easier recovery from illness, faster post-operative recovery, decreased medication use, healthier diet, green exercise, and sounder sleep. So I want to finish this lecture by looking at that word wisdom briefly. And it means, literally it means love of Sophia. Sophia is the image of wisdom in many different cultural backgrounds and forms of lore. She also has sisters across different mythic pantheons. So we call her Sophia in one, but wisdom appears in many different forms. In Chinese mythology, she shows up as Nuwa. In Native American, white buffalo calf woman. The Greeks knew her as Athena and Minerva. So there's something archetypal, to use a Jungian word, about Sophia, about wisdom. And in the ancient practice of alchemy, as well as in other mystery traditions, wisdom was more or less equivalent to what used to be called the anima mundi, the soul of the world. The sense of animation and knowledge in everything, the world soul. So what I'd like to suggest at the end of this piece on ecotherapy is that beyond the level of practices that make us feel better and that increase our health and vitality, what we're also doing when we work deeply and consciously with plants, with animals, with nature, however it expresses itself, is in some sense traditionally also working with the soul of the world. And that brings it into alignment with the pursuit of wisdom. When we work with nature that way, we become wiser. We become wiser on many different fronts, and we'll continue to see that as we go. Because in that sense, nature becomes our wisdom teacher. Nature becomes our mentor, and we learn more about relationships and about how things relate to each other and are interdependent on each other. We learn more about cause and effect. We learn more about how to be in the world and how to be part of the natural cycles of the world. And we learn more about psychopathology and health. So these are important lessons to absorb as we move forward and get to know ecotherapy better. Thanks.